Good evening to all. We are live now on YouTube via Internationalism Editorials. So we have Mr. Sudha Chakravarti. He will be interviewed for the South Asian Journal of International Law, Volume 1, Issue 1, 2020 by Mr. Lekha Agarwal, our Associate Editor. So in this session, we will discuss about cultural hypocrisy, the role of cultural diplomacy for South Asian countries like India, and I will be really happy to pass the baton to Sulekha. So good evening, Sulekha. I formally pass the baton to you.
Thank you, Abhivardhan. Good afternoon/good evening to all of you. On behalf of the South Asian Journal of International Law, I welcome you all to today's session. My name is Sulekha Agarwal. I'm a graduate of International Law from the Graduate Institute of International Law and Development Studies, Geneva, and I'm a research assistant at the International Law Commission. The topic for today's session is Indian cultural diplomacy and the role of cultural confidence at a bigger frontier. It is my privilege to welcome today Dr. Sudha Chakravarti, who is the head of research at the EU Business School and the editor-in-chief of ON Research. An expert on a number of fields, including foreign policy, international relations, development, and diplomacy, he is a lecturer on international relations at the EU Business School and has been a visiting faculty to his alma mater, the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations. He also served as research associate at CUTS International Geneva, as well as the Geneva Group of Developing Countries. Good afternoon, Dr. Chakravarti.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. It is both an honor and a privilege, and I'm happy to help with this interview.
So I would like to kick off this question from, this session from a question from a rather historic perspective. So India's non-alignment bend came at a time where there were two distinct power camps, neither of which necessarily stood for problems of the third world. And naturally, India sought to be one of the leaders. However, the power landscape has changed quite a bit since that time. Given this change, is Indian multi-alignment a very conscious effort towards reaching a certain defined aim? If yes, what? Or is it just adapting itself to a changing landscape?
Thank you for the question. I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. Yes, historically, we did take the lead with the non-alignment movement, and that would be the beacon of hope, let's say, for developing countries. But today that has changed. And since, let's say, the 1990s, we have a very multipolar world. And in a multipolar global setting, where power is not only diffused between states, but you have non-state actors, and then you have the forces of globalization, you have to be multi-aligned. Right. Because your interests are multi-aligned. Now, this is something that India, in terms of at least how the foreign policy has been perceived, is a little confusing. We haven't really, at least till, let's say, the early 2000s, we haven't really taken a strong stance on issues. Now, of course, we had to maneuver various interests, various pluralistic interests that we have in foreign policy making. But I think while you have to weigh foreign policy in terms of its costs and benefits, where we can definitely take a stand in terms of multi-alignment is definitely take a stance on value-based alignment. So whether you are aligning with certain groups or not, that's not just the question, but there are various, let's say, phenomenon in, let's say, international relations today, which are value-based. For example, climate change is one of those issues. Global pandemics is one of those issues. In those issues, I think we can take a aligned stance towards, let's say, global foreign policy making, etc. Now, is non-alignment still relevant for India? That's a separate question.
Right. So then, as you explained, it's a bipolar world.
It's a multipolar world.
Sorry, my mistake. Multipolar world. So where does India stand as a power in itself in this scheme, regionally and globally?
I think it was Shashi Tharoor who, I think, put it very succinctly. We are both superpower and super poor. And this is not something new. Even if you look at, when Mark Twain wrote about India, It is a country of fabulous wealth and fabulous poverty. So this paradox remains. So we are still extremely, let's say, we have a lot of absolute poverty, we have a lot of development issues, we have a lot of internal and domestic problems. But at the same time, we are a nuclear power, we are the third biggest economy in the world, and we are a space power. So how do we actually join these two would be the crux of the matter. So this is, I think, to balance that would be key. If that answers your question, or?
In a way, yes, but according to what I see, there are different levels of leadership on different fields. And when it comes to India, you can't distinctly say, oh, it is a complete power in international relations in itself. For example, in the present pandemic, it is taking a leadership role. So where does like you mentioned, there's like value-based leadership. So where do you see India in this value-based leadership arena?
Well, from the power perspective, I would say India is still an aspiring global power. Because to be honest, even if you want to take on value-based leadership, we have to see if we are in the position. In many ways, even China is not ready to do that. I mean, it still has a lot of domestic issues, even though the economic power or the military might, etc., their reach is very high. So in that aspect, we are still a regional superpower, if you can put it in this way. Now, what India can do is everybody's talking about the pandemic, of course, and after this pandemic, we will have kind of a new deal kind of thing. So again, it would be very interesting to see how India positions itself. So if you would have noticed, we have been absent from the non-alignment front for quite some time in terms of our interest. But today there's been a renewed interest again. I think Prime Minister Modi attended, I think, online the NAM conference. And why is that? It's nothing to do with necessarily non-alignment as such, but it is the biggest multilateral organization in the world. It has about 120 countries. So if we come out of the pandemic, and there is a possibility that many people are predicting of a future Cold War between the US and China. Now, these are all predictions. Then India can play a very, very important role in that value-based relationship, leadership, in actually mobilizing those 120 countries and leading them as being another power bloc. So there is nothing written in stone. However, we would have to see as the opportunity presents itself.
So to push you a bit further on this question, is Prime Minister Modi has been promoting the idea of India as a peace-loving nation. At the United Nations, he said India gave the world Buddha and not youth. So how far do you think we are living up to this image?
Well, that's also a tricky question. From a foreign policy perspective, I think if we have been trying to, let's say, I'm not going to use the word culture, I'm going to use the term soft power to actually bring in every aspect of it, if you don't mind. We have been trying to do that since independence. Now, if you look at the soft power resources that we have, whether it's a culture, it's a multiculturalism, tolerance, the punch shield, whatever, these resources are not new. Same with yoga, Ayurveda, to whatever else. But what has happened, at least, and I'm as apolitical as it gets, at least with the last government, there has been an enormous zeal, at least from the foreign policy perspective, to, let's say, focus on soft power approaches. So where the soft power resources of India, or the assets, are very old, implementing that in foreign policy has been, is a rather novel concept. So yes, we have been able to, let's say, if you look at the 1960s, 70s, 80s, the kind of image that India had abroad is extremely different from the kind of image India has now. Now that has happened because of various reasons. First of all, the engagement with the Indian diaspora. Okay, it's not something very novel again. But the second thing, and of course there are other reasons, but the second thing has been the proliferation of information and communications technology, through which we can connect all those dots. So if you look at the amount of, I will give you a simple example, the amount of advertisements on Make in India and everything abroad, or invest in India, that you could see in countries like Germany, or even for Swiss tourism, that has been fantastic. So yes, there has been, an export of this culture. Now, which is good, because there are various aspects of foreign policy that you can achieve through soft power votes. However, to keep in mind, and I hope there is a follow-up question on that, it has to be backed by hard power. Now, we shouldn't make the same mistakes like we did in probably 1962, when, let's say, Nehru was very, very adamant about using those soft power tactics, but that failed. And same with, let's say, if you take a recent phenomenon like the Doklam standoff, it couldn't have been solved without that. So I think there has to be a balance. Now, is India achieving that abroad in terms of soft power? Yes and no. There's a lot of showmanship, yes. But I don't think that is necessarily a political failure as such, or a failure of Prime Minister Modi as such. It is a failure of implementing that. And how do we integrate, let's say, domestic policy making, which will then feed on to foreign policy making. So this is where we stand in terms of, let's say, exporting what we export in terms of a culture, in terms of a soft.
Right. So I will still push you a bit on to this peace imagery that India promotes. So like you said, you mentioned the 60s, and India was really within non-aligned movement and kind of promoting itself as basically the protector in the region. And that really led to its acceptance of Tibetan refugees. But then subsequently, it's not been that kind to other groups, like the ones that were expelled from Bhutan, but they were not given any sort of formal recognition in India and just shipped off to Nepal. And the same with like from then Burma, now Myanmar, like different waves of refugees coming in. But India has not been so kind to them. So and again, given the recent political developments, there's been a marked difference in approach to how you're treating vulnerable groups and communities. So would you say that this can be attributed to a change in Indian approach? And where does that then put India on a cultural leadership and this protectionist imagery front?
No, I think the discussion here is, I agree to whatever you're saying, but India has also taken a role in peacekeeping, for instance, in terms of humanitarian assistance that has provided to various countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, yes, we do have major internal challenges, or domestic challenges, not internal, but let's put it this way, domestic challenges because of our geopolitical, surrounding and geopolitical issues. So yes, there is a kind of dichotomy in terms of what we are trying to export abroad. Now, what India tries to export abroad, well, you have basically two things you can do. Are you exporting opportunities? Are you exporting peace? Or are you exporting fear? Okay, so to take a completely different. So India, in terms of the storytelling abroad, is exporting that idea of peace, of inclusivity to whatever else. But I would agree with you, I think, on the domestic front, this is not being realized. So if you look at the intercommunal tensions that have increased, or at least the rhetoric that we hear about it, its treatment of, let's say, whether the Rohingyas or Burma or in Bangladesh, etc., that is not living up to the image. So that is why when I mentioned that, yes, it is important, and I think we are doing quite a good job in exporting the idea of India abroad, that has to be backed up domestically. So yes, you do get that. You get that dichotomy in terms of we're trying to position ourselves in one ways, and the perception that the international community has could be, not aligned very well. On the other hand, yes, I would still argue that we have contributed towards peacekeeping, towards the international order, towards global peace in many different ways.
So bringing in the pandemic perspective now, so what do you think will the power structures look like once and when this pandemic is over? And what would that mean for India, especially in terms of, since we are talking about alignment, what would it look like for India?
This, again, it's not a question you can just answer. It would depend on the international order itself. So of course, if we have a Cold War kind of a situation, okay, then of course it makes sense for India to lead another group like, let's say, the non-alignment movement. And here, I mean, India has a great position, because if you look at the founding members, Yugoslavia, which does not exist today, and Egypt, I think India can take. And India is recognized as a responsible power in this case. So that is there. Okay. But on the other hand, what India can definitely take a leadership in the post-pandemic world is, again, as I said, those value-based. And India is doing something. You have the International Solar Alliance that India has, or the disaster resilient network that India has. These are the things that India should be focused on, and then try to position. At the same time, many critiques, they have a problem with Indian foreign policy when they say that the strategic interest of India is not very clear. Now, that is true in terms of, if you look at the literature and everything else, it's sometimes disjointed. But I think it is also good to have some sort of ambiguity in foreign policy. In foreign policy is not an area where you kind of have your strategic goals and etc. that is written in stone. You have to have that, space to be able to maneuver. So I would say, yes, you should have certain strategic goals. Okay, for example, looking at something that India cannot definitely ignore is the surrounding our immediate neighborhood. Okay, then if you want to act east, so your neighborhood basically is key to your success. Okay, so these are the things that you must have. But on the other hand, in terms of what approaches we take towards multi-alignment or what we align with, that could be left a little ambiguous. Okay, because with the COVID situation, nobody has an idea. Okay, and that's what we have seen with global leadership or with anything else. Nobody has an idea. So at the moment, all we can do is venture a guess, and then you can build in different scenarios and everything.
Right. So I'll pick up on that point you mentioned about looking towards your neighborhood. So it's been a while that it was propounded that China was pursuing a string of pearls strategy. That's when India came with a look east policy. But in my experience, it's only very recently that India has been actively following up with its members in the region. So would you say that this move has come in a bit too late?
Better late than never, but I completely agree with you that even if you look at the terminology, the look east policy has been there for the last 20, 25 or whatever, after, let's say, liberalization of the Indian economy. But today we have an act east policy. So even the terminology matters. And in terms of engagement, I don't think, I think SAARC is becoming increasingly dysfunctional because of, let's say, the issues that India and Pakistan have, and that kind of derails any kind of talks. But in terms of India's engagement in its immediate neighborhood, whether you look at Nepal, which is an outlier country, Bhutan is always, of course, there. Bangladesh has been a success in many ways in terms of various aspects in terms of energy, water, and everything else. Now, the two, let's say, two areas we should also focus on, but it is kind of ambiguous, is Sri Lanka and Maldives. Although the Rajapaksa government is not there anymore, but India has not been able to push its agenda. And here China has been extremely successful. But you have to also understand it's not just us, let's say, if you're talking from an Indian foreign policy point of view, that these are the things we have to do, we should do. It is a chessboard. Okay, so you have the other moves by other competing nations. And it's basically, till now, it has been who reaches there first. So China has immense economic influence in the region. So if you're looking at Pakistan, if you're looking at Maldives, Bangladesh, Burma, etc., so the string of pearls that you have. And one of the worries is it's tactically a two-pronged approach, although this is for trade and the BRI and everything else, but it could be, there is a concern that it could be militarized and hence, dominate, let's say, India in its own hegemonic areas of interest, which is the Indian Ocean. So, I would say focus on the immediate neighborhood, there's no way out. Second, have an Indian Ocean policy. Historically, if you look at it, even in terms of medieval and ancient Indian influence, and I think there's a brilliant book written by Robert Kaplan, it's called Monsoon, where he talks about the Indian influence or hegemony, if you want to call it, extended from East Africa all the way to Vietnam. Okay, and you will find those cultural aspects, religious aspects, even how people dress, etc. And Vietnam is a classical example. You have the sarong and you have the pants, which is China and India. And the Chinese influence has been very vertical, looking at East Asia is different, but let's say in terms of Southeast Asia. And of course, they converge. And in those lines of convergence, what we also call fault lines, this is where we really need to think about in terms of what are our moves. Okay, but neighborhood policy definitely first. No doubt.
So, as far as the Belt and Road Initiative is concerned, what does this strategically really mean for India?
There is argument on both sides. India has been reluctant to join the BRI. And the reasons, the rationale, and they're justified, extremely justified. One is the economic corridor, which will go through Pakistani occupied Kashmir. And the second thing is the lack of transparency and accountability in terms of funding those projects and infrastructure development, etc. Now, those two reasons are well-founded. Okay, but the other way of looking at it, what a lot of other experts have opined, is India could lose that opportunity. Now, this has also been one of our tactics, at least maybe it still holds relevant today. Like when we started becoming an aspiring country, let's say post-1990s, one of the foreign policy aspects was to join as many tables and forums as possible. Okay, so it's like the 100 flowers blossom kind of a thing. Join as many things and then, negotiate on whatever positions, values, or whatever in terms of interest. Now, there is truth to the argument that India could also use the BRI as its strategic weapon. Okay, and some experts have opined, like, why not? I mean, if you're looking at, let's say, Gwadar port, to, let's say, you make an economic corridor which will go through POK to Xinjiang and everything, why not, and to Kashgar, why not have a Kandla to Kashgar economic corridor? Okay, or extend that Bombay-Delhi economic corridor to Kashgar. Okay, so this will benefit India in a way, because that provides a geopolitical competition, okay, towards Pakistan. Okay, so that now you have more options, you're placing more options in the table. Secondly, India benefits from this infrastructure, probably, that you can argue. And the third, which is a valid concern in terms of transparency and legitimacy, India is in a position, I would say, to negotiate that. So to bring in examples like, wherever the BRI or Chinese investments have gone in, let's say Sri Lanka, and that has been disastrous towards the sovereignty, I think you cannot use the same arguments in the case of India. So the devil lies in the details in how we negotiate that. So I don't see any reasons why we should be extremely, let's say, happy about the super fast, I think, bullet train between the project between, I think, Bombay and Ahmedabad, and not be happy about Kolkata to Kunming, okay, because it will also integrate the entire region. Okay, so you have to use these those infrastructure, let's say, projects will also help us to integrate the region. So neighborhood policy, when I talk about neighborhood policy first, this is how you do it. So you have to balance that, of course. So you have concerns of transparency, you have concerns of geopolitics, but at the same time, it could be used as a strategic weapon.
So if I understand it correctly, so there is this huge concern about building up relations within the neighborhood, which would also include China. But now that's a complicated engagement. So on one hand, you're trying to prevent your neighbors from falling into Chinese orbit. And it's arguable that it's already gone a bit too far to take prevention strategies. So how would you propose India should approach this going forward?
I don't necessarily agree in terms of that. Yes, we are competing nations because of its size, because of its geographical proximity, and both in terms of its aspirations. The Chinese success story started in the 80s and we in the 90s. Yes, we do have a border dispute, whether it's Arunachal Pradesh, whether it's in Kashmir, etc. However, the rivalry is competitive, it is not emotional. So if you look at the rivalry between India and Pakistan, that is an emotional rivalry. Here, we can actually collaborate on various aspects. Okay, so on at least, let's say, value-based aspects, which have equal consequences on both India and China. So again, to take, for instance, global warming, climate change, sustainability as such, renewable energy as such, these are the areas we can definitely cooperate. We both have similar interests in terms of energy supplies, for instance. But I think if you integrate regions, you're building more what you call pipeline diplomacy. Okay, and where the rivalry is mainly geopolitical, I think Silk Roads are better than great powers, great power rivalries. So you have to approach it in that way.
So like I mentioned about the Belt and Road Initiative, that's the argument of China that it's a historical trading route that they want to again reconstruct. Is there any alternative from the Indian perspective historically that they could exploit, apart from the fact that you did mention that you connect those ports as a part or besides, apart from the BRI? Is there a historical alternative for India to promote as a narrative?
We can. I mean, like, we don't have to do the same thing that China is doing. I think many people have pointed this out. We don't need another infrastructure project. China has always been a mercantilist country. Hence the Silk Road and today the BRI to whatever else. Now, India has, I'm not saying India has not been, but not to that extent. So what we export could be completely different. We are not a giant manufacturing hub. But just to bring back the question in terms of your previous question to China now, why these initiatives, whether it's BRI, whether if you want to have, let's say, a project, a hypothetical project, Kolkata Kunming, as soon as you have this and you have treaty-based systems, you're bound to behave. So if you're concerned about Chinese behavior, okay. Again, it's a little tricky because China hardly gets into multilateral agreements. They're always bilateral. And if you get into the table with the Chinese, let's say, foreign policy or in terms, it's very difficult in terms of the weight they bring in. But integrating, or even China's willingness to integrate, actually benefits everyone. Because the only way, if you're talking about containment policy, and I think these policies are founded on the premise of fear, and we should go away from that. That was true during the times of the Cold War, but you don't need to contain China. China contains itself. If there's a lot of assertion of, let's say, Chinese power in, let's say, Southeast Asia and everything, and you could see that over the last 20 years. In the beginning, it was seen as, wow, the amount of, let's say, investments the Chinese companies make. And now you see it leads to, your sovereignty being kind of impeded. So the best thing is to leave it on its own. Now, from the Indian side, how do we position ourselves? What are we, if China takes that we want to integrate Central Asia, and Central Asia has been so important from the Portuguese to anybody else, and that has been the major trade route for the Eurasian continent. What is it? Now, I don't have a clear answer, but what is it that we stand for? Okay, so here we can fall back on our past in terms of our soft power aspects, definitely.
So you mentioned that there are a lot of areas for collaboration between India and China, but sometimes it's not entirely clear what Chinese stand on climate change is. Well, it's true that they are really active on international forums, promoting sustainable development, really wanting to understand how it works. But then they have other aspects to it. For example, building of dams, and closer to this region in Nathula Pass, they have been excessively exploding hills to create expressways, which is quite scientifically not sustainable for this area, which is a high seismic zone. So sometimes it's very hard to read Chinese policy because it is very ambiguous. So is ambiguity, going to your point that it is good to have ambiguity in foreign policy sometimes, how do we deal with this Chinese ambiguity?
See, in a multipolar world, yes, things are going to be ambiguous. We have to start living with it in terms of uncertainty. So, because the very fact is not just about India and China, you will have to deal with cultures, with countries, and etc., who have the same interests but might have different values. So, I think my point here is I'm not getting into details about it, and I don't know the details very well. I think although we can share certain values with China. And when I talk about sustainability, etc., I think where China is one step ahead in this case is if you look at it from a perspective of international relations and international institutions, the Americans dominated, let's say, institutional, global institutions, etc. But now we see that, at least from the perspective of American foreign policy, they're reluctant to take the lead on certain aspects. Sustainability is one of them. Okay, they are not even in the Human Rights Council, etc. That's a separate story. Now, whenever there is a vacuum in that power space, theoretically, that cannot remain as a vacuum. Somebody comes and occupies that. And China is doing quite a good job in occupying. And now here we have been a little, not reluctant, probably because of policy paralysis to various other things. We are a democracy, consensus building is difficult, and etc. But we have to take those positions. Because finally, it will boil down to what global goods do we create? And by goods, I don't mean just physical goods. What global goods do we create? And in this, if you're looking at a very multipolar world, let's say even with China, the point is our destinies are intertwined. So you can look at them as rivals or as competitors or as collaborators. However, there are many challenges, okay, irrespective of our foreign policy, irrespective of our values, that we do share the same interest with. And this is where we can actually, cooperate. So it has to be both. Now, this presumption that there's ambiguity and China will take advantage, etc., I think in the short term it could be. In the long term, this does not work. As I said, China is also in a precarious geopolitical position. So it's not like they can do anything they want. So they have to also balance the fact that if it is extremely ambiguous or assertive in the region or in the broader region, you will have a multi-aligned approach, let's say multipolar approach towards containing its own power. So, and again, Chinese foreign policy making is not stupid at all. So they have a very, very clear understanding of that.
So I have a question from one of our YouTube viewers. So Akash Manwani asks, can India, together with EU, set a narrative of sustainability, inclusivity, and parity, which are European principles in trade, as well, and push for a balance to China?
Short answer, yes, definitely. Thank you, Akash, for your question, by the way. Definitely, but why with the EU is the main question. Okay, I mean, I don't see there's any fault in that rationale or something. Yes, we do share various, let's say, if you don't take it from the perspective of EU, let's say Western cultural aspect, whether you look at the aspect of, I'm not looking at democracy, but let's say liberal democracy. Okay, in terms of tolerance to whatever else, yes, we could have that. In terms of trade, again, we are moving towards a multipolar world. So if you take the EU as such, you have preferential, let's say, trade treatments to whatever else between its members. But this works when we have bipolar systems or we have unipolar systems. Even within the EU, take Switzerland. One of the reasons Switzerland has not joined the EU is because it wants to have that flexibility in getting into, let's say, trade deals to whatever else with other countries, which is not EU and not just preferential treatment for EU countries. Brexit, whether you like it or not, has been a reaction to that. And similar to, let's say in the next 20, 30 years, take a country like Germany. Would you be able to avoid China? That's the question. Whether you like it or hate it, it's a different thing. Okay, what your position is on China, what your position is on other countries, it's a different thing. But the reality is, you will have to now engage with countries with different powers who you do not see eye to eye. Okay, so that would be my simple answer. So in a multipolar world, definitely.
Right. So moving on to the next question, more on terms of cultural heritage now. So when you positively connote tangible cultural heritage, it's widely recognized as an asset to states in the exercise of soft power. Do you think there is a value in sites of dark heritage in context of soft power strategies? And that, do you think it has not been fully explored? And if yes, why?
Could you give me an example what you mean by that in terms of dark heritage?
So, for example, Germany has been quite forthcoming with its Holocaust past, and it has been using those sites, the Auschwitz and all the other ghettos, so-called the ghettos, to promote this consciousness about things that shouldn't happen again.
Mm-hmm.
So, is this an area which is under-recognized, and it could be promoted to actually promote cultural sensitivity and to use it as a prohibition for certain acts that happened in the past that shouldn't happen again?
Well, I cannot find any argument against it. Good that you mentioned Germany. And Germany has been very forthcoming in terms of, let's say, its past. And it still has that kind of a hangover. Okay, it takes about generations, to move on. If you compare it, again, being as a political as I could be, you don't have the same kind of, let's say, revision of history, or at least introspection of history from the Chinese side. Okay, but again, this also could be a roadblock. This affects the German psyche in terms of taking certain positional aspects. So the Germans have always been also, because this was committed between in the 1930s and 40s, they're very reluctant to take certain positions. And I don't think necessarily India should be one of those countries. Okay, so there is no harm, let's say, in highlighting, let's say, the dark past or whatever you have, etc. And I think people know this, and you can use can proliferate that. But I don't think that hangover is necessary, at least in the Indian case.
Right. So my follow-up to that would be then, there's this, it's actually a personal question. I have noticed that when you see histories in the not so much in the United States, but the United Kingdom, the school curriculums do not quite cover the history of colonialism, which is very essential to a large part of the world. So shouldn't then countries like India, who have been really at the well, you can't say anyone has been at the center because it equally affected everyone, but then since you could say a kind of a leader, promote this history, so that just to, in order not to for vengeance or to seek reparations as such, but to promote this idea that this is a wrong that happened and that should not be repeated, because we do see colonialistic, imperialistic patterns within international law replicating itself.
Mm-hmm. No, sure. Again, I don't have an argument against that, and I think Shashi Tharoor, he gave this Oxford Union speech, and then he's written a book actually after that, and in a very short span of time. I don't know how he does that, but he talks about this. I mean, if you're looking at, and you've had many debates, and I've followed a couple of them, at least in Britain, where colonialism is not taught in schools, and you would find that in various European countries. Now, should India take a lead? I don't think you're looking for reparations in these cases, right? So, on the other hand, if you look at, if, let's say, Britain, European countries are following this kind of a pattern where they're not really focusing on the colonial history, apart from Germany, let's say, this makes them extremely parochial. Now, this is a point which is subtly made by also Shashi Tharoor, and it makes them extremely parochial, and it actually is not beneficial for them in terms of the cosmopolitan approach that Europe had in the past. It's a simple example. I mean, if I ask you, do you know the president of Laos, to venture a guess, most people would not know, but everybody, let's say in Laos or in Korea, etc., would know who Trump is. So it's the perspective of also cosmopolitanism in terms of knowing the world. And I think this is even though, history does not repeat itself, it rhymes. We've seen that in the past when India and China were at the pinnacle, and it was not the European powers, and then it makes you parochial. That kind of success, that kind of a history makes you extremely parochial. And here it's very, very clear. Both India and China, which commanded over 20 or 25% of global GDP till the 16th, 17th century, okay, they became extremely comfortable and parochial. And hence you see when cosmopolitanism was starting in Europe. Okay, and now you have a kind of a reverse again. We are much more aware of our history. We are much more in tune with what is going on over the rest of the world than, I'm generalizing, of course, than, let's say, Western countries, or particularly in Europe. I think somebody said Europe is like a continent that is sleepwalking into oblivion. Okay, so I don't know whether that is true or not, but it is true in terms of their appreciation of their own history and how do they position themselves to move forward. And many countries are having a very tough time understanding that. So if you look at ex-colonial powers like Spain, how do they position themselves? Portugal, they had a glorious history. How do they position themselves? What other values are they bringing into the world? So these are the questions I think we have to take care of.
I will still push a bit further into that question.
Sure.
Because, that's one thing about image and how you go forward with it. But my question was more to the point of replicating patterns. So a lot of third world scholars within international law have said that international legal order is essentially still imperialistic. And even if it does not actively now encroach upon the sovereignty of these post-colonial states, there are other ways in which they are going through with the imperialistic policies, and which is very evident, especially in the way the climate change mechanisms are there. For example, let's say the carbon market, the clean development mechanism, essentially they're again getting these invasive companies or invasive projects in developing countries to then earn carbon offsets for them, which is not really doing much for the development of these countries. So my question was more to that point.
Okay, I mean, if you think that global institutions, etc., or international law, how it has, let's say, developed post-1945, you can make a case for neocolonialism and imperialistic policies, whether in development, in climate change, in carbon exchange, etc., etc. Now, why I'm not interested again in position, I mean, whether this is imperialistic or not. As a social scientist, what I want to learn is what can we do about it? Why does this exist? Now, one of the reasons is South-South cooperation. We have been talking about that, and you have lived in Geneva. There's a lot of talk about South. There's hardly any South-South cooperation. So yes, there is this imperialistic, this thing, but from an institutional perspective, I think when we move to a more multi-aligned world, okay, these things will necessarily reduce. Okay, so to not put the blame solely, let's say, on past imperialism and everything else, the developing countries have not been united either. I have been in several negotiations or talks or engagements both at the United Nations as well as the WTO. So to just by saying that institutions or legal institutions have been such is a fallacy. The second is, of course, these institutions did come up at a time of Western hegemony, so it has a Western face and, of course, Western interest. Okay, so now we also have a proliferation of other institutions. G20. Not going into whether the G20 is successful or not, but at least we have something else. We used to have the G7, which used to be in charge of anything that is economic, and that you could call it imperialistic. But come the financial crisis, and that also shows the challenges that globalization poses on power systems around the world, we now need the G20. Ian Brem said we live in a G0 world, not a single country or a coalition could solve global problems in many ways. So we have the BRICS. Okay, so and you have that kind of a shift in power. So that is happening. And it's not just states alone, you are also forgetting there's a great influence of non-state actors. Okay, and that will proliferate even more in the states.
Okay, so we have another question from our YouTube viewer. Shruti Sinha asks, soft power is about creating favorable perception about a nation's station through attraction rather than coercion. This pandemic, I believe, has dented the perception of China globally. What do you think about it?
Yes and no. It depends where you are. It has dented. It has dented from the perspective of, let's say, what you, in terms of the American allegations against it to whatever else. I don't know how much this will actually dent their overall soft power, this thing. I mean, there's a lot of talks about it, definitely. But they have also been praised. Okay, of course, there was a delay and the government functions in a completely different way, but the way they have tackled the challenge. Okay, and here, if I can bring in, although this is not a question, if I can bring in the Indian perspective. Okay, so from the perspective of India, even though you had these, in the past years, the kind of image we were giving abroad, whether it was the Citizenship Amendment Act, whether it was Article 370, the communalism that started. But here, I think the present government has been praised. So if you take, let's say, and you use this very generalized concept that Modi as being, Prime Minister Modi being a strong leader, and you equate him to people like, let's say, Vladimir Putin or Bolsonaro in Italy, he's done a very good job in being astringent about it. Okay, and then putting in place the lockdowns and everything. So it was not like brash, arrogant, and chest-beating kind of an approach, but it was quite a good approach from the Indian side. So the Chinese, yes, of course, there is a lot of flack that they're taking because it seemed to have been originated in Wuhan, and more or less in terms of pressure, in terms of how the government or the media functions, that we don't get information. Will it really dent Chinese soft power influences? I don't know, because they really back it up with hard power. This is but the first point I had made. Okay, so it's not just expansion of soft power as it is. They really back it with hard power. So, and mainly economic power. So would you be willing to let go of a deal with China, let's say if you're a Southeast Asian country, which gives you market access to the biggest country in the world? The answer is no.
So that brings us to the end of our questions, but I would really like you to then give us our final thoughts about how India can position itself in terms of soft power and kind of ride this crisis as it seems to be doing so far.
In terms of soft power, as I said, we have the resources. Okay, now we have to position it. So many blame Indian, let's say, the soft power approach or the foreign policy approach, at least in the last few years, that there's more of showmanship than substance. It might be true, but the thing is, at least get somewhere. Okay, and we are getting to places. Okay, now the flip side of that is, let's not become too narcissistic. So when we think about soft power and, let's try and spread that in terms of a cultural influence or yoga to whatever else, we can also learn from the past. Now we have, you have World Yoga Day since 2014, every June 21st, and this is, one of the victory, this thing. But it was not, and I have to be honest here, I mean, you can disagree, but it was not India promoting yoga that has gone abroad. Okay, it was never Indians promoting yoga. Okay, it was because of people like, whether it was the Beatles, Oprah Winfrey, or Madonna, that actually proliferated yoga in the West. Now, what's the point with this is, if you take a country like US, where you have an influential Indian diaspora, we should not be satisfied by just engaging them. What we should be focusing on, what is the outcome? And in a country like America, of course, if the public perception towards a certain country is good, the politics has to follow. Now, how much have we been able to, we have proliferated the ideas and the values. So yoga, Ayurveda, tolerance, whatever you want to call it, IT. Okay, the image of Indians abroad is very, very different. But how much have we been able to translate that to strategic interest? Can we use that to lobby? Can we use that to influence elections? Now, I don't mean influence elections in terms of fake stuff. I don't mean that, but influence policy making abroad. That would be key. And again, in terms of my final thought, you cannot have that bigger dichotomy. And I think, Sulekha, you brought it out really well in terms of how you want to position yourself abroad and how you're perceived. And perceptions, and sometimes, you know, in international relations, perceptions are extremely important and sometimes more important than reality. Okay, so whether you're looking at a country like Iran, it's a perceptional question for many countries. So these two things have to go hand in hand. Now, to conclude, I would say what India should focus on in terms of exporting its influence and everything. Neighborhood policy is sine qua non. Okay, you cannot do without it. Look east. Okay, extended neighborhood, what the Russians call near abroad. Join as many forums. Okay, it gives us the platform. Definitely. Engage, collaborate, compete. There has to be a holistic policy behind that. It cannot be China as a competitor. Okay, we can collaborate. And of course, in terms of the most important thing in terms of soft power or cultural diplomacy is we need to understand what we export. Okay, because if you're going by what Professor Joseph Nye states, as you mentioned, soft power, he says that the success in the 21st century is not going to come with whichever country has the biggest army or economy, is the country that tells the best story. Now, what is the story India tells? To break it down, okay, what are the public goods, international goods that we create that benefits everybody? Okay, so if you look at the Americans, they have Coca-Cola, McDonald's, American universities, to whatever else. So you might hate America, but you still consume that. Okay, what is it that we create that attracts people towards our system of values, our interest, and our foreign policy? I think with that, I would conclude.
Thank you so much. This brings us to the end of today's session. A big thank you to all our listeners. Dr. Chakravarty, I would really like to express my deep gratitude for accepting our proposal to be with us today for this session, as far as your very holistic and thought-provoking responses. It is indeed been an honor to share this session with you, and I look forward to many such future dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I said, it is an honor and a pleasure, and all the best to you guys in the future. It was great collaborating with you. And thank you, Sulekha, for the very, very pertinent questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.